We are delighted to welcome Roberto Franzini Tibaldeo. He teaches philosophy in the postgraduate program in philosophy at the Pontifical University of Paraná in the city of Curitiba, Brazil. His research focuses on continental philosophy, especially nihilism, ethics, irresponsibility, Hans Jonas, and philosophy of education, especially philosophy for children. So, welcome, Roberto.
Thank you, Anastasia, and I'm happy to be here to present this paper today. Well, actually, it's not a paper, it's a research stemming from a book I'm writing on this very interesting educational proposal, which is philosophy for children, and it's now worldwide spread. Although there are still some aspects of this educational revolution which are overlooked, and one of these aspects has to do with a gender issue, let me say, because my presentation will focus on Margaret Sharp. I don't know if some of you are already acquainted with her work. But she was a very interesting both philosopher and team builder. But her works and her contribution to the philosophy for children movement and curriculum has for many decades been overlooked because mainly in the scientific scholarship, the name of the other founder of this movement, which is Matthew Lipman, was more recognized, scientifically speaking. And so my attempt is to, on the one side, rebuild somehow the history of this movement, which is very lively and very interesting, I think. And rebalance the role played by Margaret Sharp within this adventure, because actually philosophy for children and the curriculum of novels, instructional manuals which were developed would not be the same without Margaret Sharp. And so it's also an attempt to tell scholars pay attention to the relationship between Matthew Lipman and Margaret Sharp, because philosophy for children was a educational proposal based on dialogue. And not only theoretical dialogue, but dialogue as a practice, and so philosophy as a practice of dialogue. Philosophy for children would not have been so effective if it had not been, had not been the result of the dialogue, of the mutual dialogue between the two founders, Matthew Lipman and Margaret Sharp. So this is somehow the framework of what I'm going to propose. I'm going to share the screen. And so actually, this is Margaret Sharp, and so she was born in 1942, and she died 12 years ago in 2010. Curiously, the two founders of Philosophy for Children, Margaret Sharp and Matthew Lipman, more or less died in the same year. So Matthew Lipman also died in the same period of time. So it's interesting because now we are in a phase when the followers of the followers and the pupils of Sharp and Lipman have now the responsibility to rebuild or continue this movement. In brief, the outline of the presentation is this. So a first glance at Sharp's biography, then some key aspects of her thinking, philosophical thinking, and then some reflections, but only one reflection on the legacy, so the future of her suggestions for us. As regards biography, here at the same time, very quickly, I can say that she was of Irish Catholic origins. And she studied in Catholic universities. 63, she got her bachelor in intellectual history, her Master of Arts 3 years following in American and Latin American history. Then she started teaching, and she taught in historically Black colleges and universities. So she was of Catholic origins, Irish Catholic origins, and then she taught from 65, 66 world history in Fayetteville State College, and the following year in the Virginia Union University in Richmond, and both of these institutions were Black colleges, HBCUs. So she was a white Catholic of Irish origins woman, and she taught in Black colleges and universities. And there is a passage in in one of her works, which is the quote I put in the slide, and she talks about what happened and how she was considered by the population of the city, by her students. She was different. It was a white woman teaching in a Black college. But this experience was very important to her, and she enjoyed, as she says here, she enjoyed every minute of it, even when I was scared to death. By the way, the 60s were years in which, years when the racial issue in the United States was very important, very tense as well. So she somehow took part in this adventure. Then she married, and again, a very interesting experience she had. She was teaching at the Notre Dame College for Women in Manchester. But at the same time, she was with her husband, house parent to a group of teenagers, high IQ kids, who were, however, who were dysfunctional and unfit for standard classroom setting. And so this was also an experience, and she says about this experience that it was where she learned what community of philosophical inquiry meant. And this expression, community of philosophical inquiry, is something we will return to shortly. Then she continued studying, and she got her doctorate degree in education. But her interest in philosophy was at the same time very strong. And so the title of her dissertation was in philosophy of education, actually. And she focused on the philosophy of education of Friedrich Nietzsche. And the title was The Teacher as Liberator, and also this theme of liberation, intellectual liberation, human liberation, was one of the important aspects, key aspects of her thinking, and then of her educational practice. Then in 1973, and finally, I must say, she was hired as assistant professor and then full professor at Montclair Montclair State College, now university, where in the very same year she met and she encountered with Matthew Lipman, and she contributed greatly to the foundation of the so-called IAPC, so the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children, which still exists in the very same university, and which became the propulsive center of this educational reform, or I would say also revolution, called Philosophy for Children. And Anne Margaret Sharp, I didn't know her personally, but I read something biographical on her account, and I spoke with some people who knew her personally, and they all say that she was a very lively, energetic, proactive person, and whose great capacity was human capacity. She was capable of listening, she was capable of team building. And so one of the reasons why Philosophy for Children was capable of spreading all over the world was thanks to her efforts in teacher education, in teacher training, and in community building, let me say. And so the idea, the theoretical idea behind Philosophy for Children, which was this philosophy as a way of building dialogues and building bridges among people, was not only a theoretical idea, but she was capable of putting this idea into practice. So I would say this is just to introduce her life, and then going ahead to some key aspects of her thinking. The first is the reasons why she was so engaged in education. As I also already mentioned, the years when she took the stage of teaching were the 60s, and 60s in America were very tense years, not only from a political point of view, but also from an economic point of view. We know, because we still see the consequences of this today, so-called current neoliberalism is one of the results stemming from the capitalistic, consumeristic society, which from the 60s onwards, let me say, had a sort of a boost. And this was the times when mass communication started to forge people, forge the minds of people. And by the way, this worry was something that she put into an educational perspective. So how to educate the children of the future, given that this was the problematic context. This worry was the same she shared with Matthew Lipman. Moreover, she had a specific, I would say, gender sensitivity towards, it's what is written here in the last 4 lines, the commercial success of the fashion and cosmetic industries testifies to the effectiveness of commercial media encouraging women to think that the good life is one of sensation, consumerism, and devotion to projecting a certain image for the public, masculine gaze. She was very concerned with this consumerism affecting all people, but specifically women and girls. So this was the first strong motivation to find a solution, and a solution on an educational level. This was her field of action. And the second was taking a look at schools. Schools were not places in the 60s, and we may ask if they have become different today. Schools were not places where children or pupils actively engaged in something meaningful. Most of the time, schools were places where children only listened passively to educational contents, which maybe they even didn't find meaningful. So this was something had to be done to revolutionize. By the way, and in brackets, Lippmann and Sharp and Philosophy for Children is not the only philosophical or educational movement that tackles this issue. The 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and so on are very lively in this regard. There are very many attempts all over the world. In Brazil, there is Freire. Elsewhere, there is Freinet, Feuerstein. Very many educational ways of tackling this problem. But the problem is traditional education and the ineffectiveness of traditional education. This debate is still very interesting and lively and controversial today. So it's something we still have to think upon. This is the background, so not the biographical, but the motivational background for her proposal, and the key aspect, one of the key aspects, but I think maybe the most interesting, also this key aspect she shared with Matthew Lippmann, because they both conceived of this community of philosophical inquiry. This idea was something quite peculiar, because philosophy was usually in the 60s and the 70s especially, philosophy was thought as something which was unfit, for which children were unfit, because there was an idea of philosophy as only a theoretic, abstract, formal stuff, which was for adults, or as Piaget said, only for those teenagers who had already developed a formal stage of development, of cognitive development. Sharp and Lippmann directly tackled this issue, and this forceful dialogue with the coeval context, and with the coeval psychological context, and with the coeval philosophical context, resulted in a different stance on philosophy they took. For them, and by the way, in this regard, they also refer to a different philosophical tradition. And American pragmatism supported this quite a lot, in the sense that American pragmatism had a more practical idea, context-based and context-situated idea of philosophy, as something which had to do with changing things in the world. This idea was amplified by Lippmann and Sharp, and transformed in a dialogic, interpersonal sense, because philosophy was not an effort, was not an abstract effort at all. It was practical, it had to do, and it had to do with ordinary life, but it was not an effort people engaged in individually. they dialogued with others, and this dialogue resulted in a community of people doing philosophy. But what this doing philosophy was called inquiry, because it was a way of investigating into problems, of clarifying situations, of clarifying one's ideas, which then resulted in changing one's perspective and ultimately changing one's own behavior. So it was a joint effort, philosophy as doing philosophy, as inquiring and changing perspective. So it was a thinking on thinking, which resulted in changing thinking, and additionally resulted in something ethical, which was changing one's behavior. This is why the community of philosophical inquiry and their perspective was also, I mean, endowed with ethical and political resonance or relevance, I would say. And this is something I just commented. And this idea was a way of tackling and dealing successfully with one of the problematic outcomes of consumerism, which is even more evident today, which is individualism, education only as acquiring, let me say, profitable competencies, and human existence as understood only as individual self-realization. The community of philosophical inquiry and the underlying idea of philosophy as doing philosophy together was capable of, changing things a bit. And additionally, the other additional, I would say, Sharpian way of understanding this has to do with the gender issue. I already mentioned the gender issue regarding the girls and the masculine gaze they had to acquire, or they had to, live their lives as if they were always under this masculine gaze. Philosophical inquiry was a way of defeating this problem, also because philosophical inquiry was a way of acquiring care. And actually, both Lippmann and Sharp also spoke of caring thinking. And this is something still quite interesting and controversial. But to care was, in their reflection upon the community of philosophical inquiry, care gained a twofold meaning. You care for the others, for the other people, for the co-inquirers with whom you are inquiring, but you also care for what you are discussing. You care for the results of the discussion, because what you are discussing is meaningful to you. So the focus on a different kind of education based on meaningful issues resulted in care as an additional motivation and a different attitude towards what you are discussing. And also an attitude of cooperativeness. And in this reference to care, Sharp evidenced a thorough knowledge of the coeval, I must say, literature on care. So she quotes Iris Murdoch, but Gilligan, she quotes very many other scholars and authors, and she develops, Sharp and Lippmann, but especially Sharp develops this issue of caring thinking in the 90s, and the 90s, between the 80s and the 90s, but in the 90s especially, were years in which these perspectives, feminist perspectives on care were very strong still nowadays, but it was years when these issues were debated. And actually, this is why also the educational perspective is important, because the community of philosophical inquiry is able to support the development of moral and political awareness on the one hand and behaviors on the other hand. So to say it in a word, to result in a more democratic education. So this was the perspective. And caring thinking is what I already mentioned. So this twofold aspect of caring for the others, what the others think, and care for what you are thinking with the others, with the other participants. And so not only because also this had been a very lengthy debate over the decades, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. There was, in the US especially, educational scientists, administrators were worried because children were incapable of reasoning. So they first conceived of a way of stimulating their critical thinking. But Lippmann and Sharp thought that focusing on critical thinking and only on critical thinking was too little, because critical thinking and logic competencies and reasoning competencies had to be put into the ordinary life. Ordinary life means everyday existence, and especially where people engage relationships with others. And in engaging relationships with others, we of course think, but it's not that we only think critically, or we should only think critically, because in engaging with ordinary world, in addition to critical thinking, we should also mobilize what they call caring thinking and creative thinking. So their focus was on the multidimensionality of thinking: critical, creative, and caring, the 3 C's of the philosophy for children, as a way of, attaining a wider educational perspective, which could result being also more effective. And here is a poem Sharp wrote. This is an unpublished poem, which is preserved at the IAPC archive. And I find interesting because there is, it's a poem she wrote to her mirror. And she says at a certain point, you don't care about me. No, the mirror doesn't care about her, because the mirror never reflects her thoughts, her dreams, her ideas, her ideals, which means, so the key word here, I think, is reflect. The mirror reflects, of course, it's the mirror's job to reflect from a physical point of view, but reflect is also a word which means to think, reflection. And so it was as if Sharp was saying that there are 2 kinds of reflection, 2 kinds of thinking. One is reflection without care. I'm very able at reflecting logically, critically, etc., but maybe then I don't care for others. I don't care about the contexts in which my thinking is applicable. There is a higher level of thinking I can achieve, which is reflection and care, reflecting care, caring reflection with care. And so I like this poem very much because I think she, well, at least it's sort of interpreting Sharp's poem, and which I think revolves around caring thinking. Now, just to conclude, some words about Anne Margaret Sharp's legacy, the future. There is a couple of quotes to Sharp and Lippmann both also wrote philosophical novels, because their educational proposal, I didn't say much about the philosophical practice, because this thing of the philosophy for children was put into practice, and it had the philosophical session had a sort of structure. I didn't say much about this, but what I can say now is that the starting point, the first phase of the philosophical session was always a quote or a chapter, some paragraphs, section of a novel. And it was Sharp and Lippmann themselves who wrote these philosophical novels for children. And these novels became then the official novels of the IAPC curriculum in philosophy for children, etc., etc. But then there were some novels which were not even published. And in one of these novels, Sharp wrote in 1980, there is a story of a girl, Mike, and in this novel, the protagonist reflects and proposes what I summarized here. So, freedom for a child is when she has the tools to think for herself, and this was one of the aims of philosophy for children. And the role of teachers, they should help girls as well as boys to think for themselves in an imaginative and creative way. So the relevance of creative thinking, because it's this that constitutes their personhood. And then Sharp asks as a provocation, would civilization crumble if we taught children to think for themselves, if we taught them to question the ways of society? And so it's 2 days, there is again war in Europe. After many decades, we even thought that wars could be ever fought, or at least we considered them to happen elsewhere. But now again, it's at the doors of Europe. And so the question is, have we to question the ways of society? And so I think that these ideas by Sharp and Lippmann, but especially these lines by Sharp, at least give us the possibility to imagine things differently. So and not to take things as they always ordinarily happen, not to take them always for granted. And so also never to abandon our responsibility to question the ways of society. This is something Sharp provokingly asks as regards children education, but I think we are all involved in this. So it's our duty, to always keep in mind these duties. So I think Sharp and Lippmann, but especially Sharp, I find her very inspiring for this, for this duty, for this task we have always ahead of us. And so it was this in a nutshell. Thank you for listening.